Good afternoon, everybody, and it's very good to be here to unveil what's the 6th annual Digital News Report. And I should just tell you that this is the first year where we actually have physical copies of the report here as well that will be available after we finish today, so after we finish this session, so you can peruse those at your leisure as well. We're doing this launch here this afternoon. There's been another event in Helsinki, launching a Finnish edition of the report this morning. And there's a launch in a couple of hours' time in New York, lunchtime, New York time. So there's a lot of activity going on this year around this report, around the world. As you know, this is the world's biggest ongoing survey of news. It covers 70,000 people in 36 countries and 5 continents. We've added 3 countries this year in Central and South America. That's Chile, Mexico, and Argentina. We've added 4 markets in Asia, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia, and 3 more in Europe, Croatia, Slovakia, and Romania. That makes the total in Europe 23 countries, including, of course, Austria. So here's the full list of countries, and hopefully yours is represented. And I should say, as I do every year, that this is done through an online poll, and so it's representative of news consumers who are online, but not of the national population. So as such, it will tend to underrepresent traditional news behavior such as television, print, and radio. And so where we talk about cross-platform behavior, you need to bear that in mind. And the polling for the report is conducted by YouGov on our behalf. And you can see here on the chart here that there's samples of around 2,000 people in pretty much all the 36 countries that we've covered. We're really grateful to a wide range of sponsors, including the Thomson Reuters Foundation, who are the core sponsor of the Reuters Institute, and then to the many people involved specifically in supporting the report. They include Google, the BBC, industry associations, regulators, and several universities. And we also work with other partners around the world, including the University of Salzburg here in Austria, who have produced their own national report for this country. So what I'm going to do in a minute is I'm going to hand over to Nick Newman, who's going to talk through the main findings from this year's report. Nick will present for about 25 minutes, and then we'll move on to a Q&A. But now over to Nick, and then the Q&A afterwards. Nick.
Thank you, David. Thanks very much. It's really good to be here to present some of our findings. Not all of them, but some of them you'll be pleased to hear. I'm going to focus on 5 key trends today. So firstly, we've heard about it a lot already today. So trust in the news and in social media in particular is low. You heard Marty Barron in the keynote this morning talking about how digital news has become polluted by falsehoods and by conspiracies. So we were very interested this year to try and understand what lies behind that. So that's one theme. And then secondly, there's the question about whether this debate about fake news is making journalism more valuable. So we see that in the United States, but not yet elsewhere. So we'll explore all that a little bit. Thirdly, there's a very interesting shift towards private messaging apps. So from the sort of world of open social networks like Facebook towards more closed messaging. We'll talk about that. Slightly counterintuitively, we're going to talk about far from sort of echo chambers. Social media and search seem to expose people to more sources of news, which is good, I guess, more diversity, but brand recognition is low. So a bit of a double-edged sword there. And you won't be surprised by this one, we're becoming more dependent, even more dependent on the smartphone. Okay, so starting with that issue of trust and so-called fake news. And we find trust is pretty low in social media generally, with just 24% across all of our countries saying it does a good job in separating out fact from fiction. And we talked to a range of respondents around the world about what they mean by that. So some people talk about, how it's like a petri dish for ideological fake news. So this was somebody in the United States, for example. There's the whole question of sharing. So here's somebody talking about people share without reading the information in the article. And we picked up, quite a lot of irritation that their feeds are being polluted within social media in a way that they maybe weren't a year or so ago. On the other hand, there are people, 24%, who say that social media does do a good job. So for many people, it provides a more authentic voice, perspectives that you can't get on the mainstream media as well, of course. So this is not a universal story. But we ask the same question about the news media, so the traditional media effectively. And if we compare social media to mainstream media with the same question, we find that about twice as many people, so 40%, think the news media does a good job in separating fact from fiction. So it's not exactly a ringing endorsement, but it's definitely something to build on. And those people who think that say that, of course, it is the journalist's job. It is what they do. They sift false information from the correct information to bring credible reports. And that crucially with journalism, what you get is accountability. You know, there are bylines, there's the reputation of the brand that's at stake. And that's something I think that media companies can really, really build on, as a number of speakers already today have talked about that issue. If we look at the issue of trust more widely, and this is a question we ask about trust in the news in general, so to what extent do you agree that you trust the news in general most of the time? We see huge variations across countries, so great diversity. Trust tends to be strongest in Northern Europe, Scandinavian countries. So at the left of that chart, you have Finland, which was our number one last year, number one still, 62%. At the other end, you see Korea and Greece, South Korea, that is, at 23%. And in both of those countries, the media is broadly just not seen as credible and independent from political or business interests. Another sort of development is, I come from the UK, very interesting to us in the UK that trust is down 7 percentage points in the UK since the Brexit vote. And I think, I'll talk in a minute about why that's been such a polarizing issue and why it might have affected the trust figures. The US is interested, we've already heard from Marty Barron, low trust in general. A number of polls have sort of looked at that, sort of 38%. But when you ask people, do you trust the sources you use, and that could be Fox News on the one hand or the Washington Post on the other, you get a much higher score, so 53%. So what that tells us is here is a country that is deeply polarized, and there's a big difference. And one of the things we wanted to do was to really understand and visualize what that might look like. So what does media polarization look like in different countries? So what we've done is created effectively a left-right spectrum based on questions we ask in the poll about, do you consider yourself left-wing, right-wing, and a range of things in between. And then we've also tracked what those people use, so which brands they use, and then the amount of usage, and we've mashed all that together to give us a picture of media systems. So this is the media system in the United States. And the bubbles, as I say, represent broadly the amount of brands. So the bigger the bubble, the more they're being used. So let's put some names on that. And what you see is this is from the user's perspective, remember. So the people who in the center are the midpoint of US opinion. And you see that real collection, including the so-called liberal media. There is a liberal media, and those people effectively are serving a liberal audience. And then there's this huge gap on the right-hand side with just Fox News on its own, serving the people who have a different view. So, Marty Barron talked about in the United States, there's no sharing of the facts. And you can see in that chart how different these communities are. And then on top of that, of course, we've had the rise in the United States over the last 18 months of hyper-partisan online media. So we've plotted those on the map, and you can see Breitbart on the right. I've just taken Occupy Democrats on the left. There's obviously a lot of hyper-partisan sites in the United States. And I think this picture really helps to explain some of the mistrust that you see in the United States. So most of it comes from the right because they feel they are not represented. And just a couple of quotes around that. So Fox News keeps it fair, CNN tells us left-wing lies. I quite like this one. They're so far to the left, they might as well fall off. So people who self-identify on the right, in fact, are 3 times as likely to mistrust the media as those on the left. So the majority of mistrust that we found anyway in the States is related to political polarization. So let's compare that picture to the United Kingdom, and we find quite a different story. So this is the map for the UK, and you see a pretty good spread actually. So the right is actually quite well represented in the UK. Many people talk about the right-wing press, and there's a range on the left too. Let's put some names on it. So you can see the Mail online on the right, the Times is there, the Telegraph on the right, the Guardian online on the left. But the big difference is we have a big public service broadcaster. This is online brands, by the way. BBC Online, which across radio, television, and online reaches 70% of the people. So there is, by contrast with the States, there is a common set of facts and a certain amount of range as well. But also in the UK, we have seen the rise of high partisan sites, often distributed obviously by social media. So you have Breitbart on the right and the Canary, which has been very active both in the referendum campaign but also the recent election on the left. So much smaller than the US though, so it's a much smaller phenomenon so far but growing. And then since Brexit, what we've seen is an increasingly polarized political landscape with the BBC in the centre, increasingly in the firing line, as these comments make clear. So, you know, I used to value the BBC News, but now it's just a mouthpiece for liberal leftists, somebody on the right, somebody on the left saying, even the BBC tends to support far right-wing party nowadays. They're referring to UKIP, who was the political party supporting Brexit. So I think it's harder for media that is trying to be balanced in a more polarized situation. And then let's look at Germany as a third example, and here we see a slightly more fragmented picture. So in Germany you have multiple public service and commercial news organizations, but what you see is the width is more constrained. So there's not as much debate. There's no significant high partisan news organizations online in Germany, not significant ones. And so what we find is mistrust, when you dig down into the comments, is much more about a sense that the media is almost too constrained, that it's actually too close to the establishment, and that, as people say here, things are being hushed up, that the media is in a conspiracy with the politicians, the full truth is not being told. So you see different scenarios in different countries, depending on the media system. So polarization, I think, is part of the story about mistrust and bias, but the story is different in different countries, and in the printed copies, which you'll get at the end, you can look at your country. We've tried to capture some of that complexity. Just one final point about trust before I move on. Going back to the UK for a minute, in an online world, you often use multiple brands to try different things, so you don't just stick with one brand. And what we found is you trust them for different things. So we asked this year about different attributes of brands. So which brand do you use for accurate and reliable news? Which brand would you use for helping you understand a story? Which brand would you use for strong opinions or for amusing and entertaining content? And you get quite different pictures. So I've just picked out 3 UK brands, the BBC, The Guardian, and BuzzFeed. And it's quite a complicated slide, I'll just sort of take you through it. So you've got the attributes around the edge. But the BBC, for example, 70% of people who use the BBC News website say that it is the best brand for online news, whereas only 21% of people who read The Guardian say it's the best for accurate and reliable news, and 2% who use BuzzFeed. And that's because, of course, they're using BuzzFeed News for a bit of downtime and a bit of entertainment. So I think the takeaway in the online world is that people mix and match between brands. And so, as again, Marty Barron was talking about this morning, it's been really important to know what you stand for, which of those attributes you're going to compete in. Okay, so one of the most interesting findings this year, for me anyway, was the changing shape of the social media landscape. We've been talking about it for a long time, and on the surface, a lot of things look very similar. So on average, over half of us say we get news from social media. So the average 54% across all 36 countries say they use social media for news each week. We see continued growth in the US and the UK. So actually twice as many using social media for news there as there were 5 years ago. Though I've explained there's particular issues in both of those markets. But elsewhere, in a large number of countries, we start to see a decline in the reported use of social media for news. So the dip in Spain, France, Germany, Portugal down 4 points, Sweden down 5, here in Austria down 3 points. And it's hard to know exactly what's going on. It could be to do with the trust issues that I referred to at the beginning. It could be changes to the Facebook algorithm that has prioritized friends and family a little bit more than professional content. Or it could be the rise of messaging apps. It's hard to be sure. It's probably a mix of all those three things. If we look in a bit more detail by network, so this is essentially the social networks you're seeing on the left-hand side, and the dark blue line is, are you using these networks for any purpose? So Facebook, 70% of people across all the countries are using Facebook for any purpose. 47%, almost half, are using it for news. So it's still really, really important. And then YouTube, more in some countries than others. Twitter is still pretty strong for news, in third place for the news part, so the light blue, 10%, and other networks as well. But then on the messaging side, we see some real change. So WhatsApp is used for any purpose now by 40%, and in some countries around 60% are using WhatsApp for any purpose, and 15% for news, the light blue. And this time last year it was about 8%. So really significant change there. Of course, we've only started tracking Facebook Messenger this year. It's worth remembering, of course, that Facebook as a company owns WhatsApp as well as Instagram. So in total, here's the total figure, 80% of us are touching a Facebook product every week. It's about 54% if you just look at the news, but in terms of overall use, about 80%. And in terms of the messaging, the international variations are pretty extreme. So you have, for example, in Malaysia, 51% are using WhatsApp for news. 25% in Turkey, where, of course, it can be very dangerous to express political views in open networks like Facebook or Twitter. So you can see why the figures there have increased significantly in the last 12 months in Turkey, gone up about 8 percentage points. And of course, much of the sharing in these new closed environments is organic, so there aren't algorithms that you can influence in the same way. The graphic on the right basically looks at some of the media companies who are experimenting in this space. So you have CNN there. FT is experimenting with WhatsApp at the moment. The one on the right there is The Economist and Line. And just worth pointing out that in Asia, Line is incredibly strong, so 45% in Taiwan, for example. So you can see different networks are important in different parts of the world. Another key and perhaps surprising finding around both social media and other distributed platforms is that far from creating these sort of echo chambers, for most people, they help expose them to actually a greater number of sources and even greater variety within the sources as well. So just to put some figures on that, so the average person who uses social media for news uses about 4.34 sources of news, where it's just over 3 if you don't use social media for news. So it's kind of exposing you through those feeds to more sources. That's the incidental exposure. It may also have an echo chamber effect, but there's a positive effect there as well. And search engines even more so. So if you use search engines, you get the lists of lots of different brands, then you are actually exposed to more brands, you use more brands than people who don't use search engines for news. But, and it's obviously a big but, the problem is in those distributed environments, as those brands are flitting through, you don't necessarily recognize or remember the brand that you've actually clicked on. So this is some research we did in the UK, just in the UK this year, where we were looking at what people were doing using passive tracking. And then we asked a proportion of them, about 24 hours later, we asked them, do you remember reading the story, but do you remember the name of the brand? And do you remember where you saw the brand? And what we find is that 81% could remember when they come from a different part of the same website. So most people who were on a website could remember that's where they found it, and they could correctly attribute the brand. But from search, only 37% could remember the name of the brand. And in social media, a little bit more, so 47%, with slightly higher figures from Twitter. So the point about this is essentially in an aggregated environment, it is harder to pick out the brand. And I think that has implications for media companies that, their whole strategy in social media may be about marketing, maybe about brand awareness, maybe you're not getting as much brand awareness, I think. Moving on to mobile. And in general, we see a flattening of growth, so we're kind of coming to the end of the first phase of the mobile revolution, I think. Most people who are ever going to use a smartphone for news are already using a smartphone for news in the developed world. But I think the intensity with which we're using these devices and our dependence on them, that's what continues to grow. So this is just a chart from the US. I could have picked almost any country, and showing the US effectively reaching that tipping point. It's a question we ask about what's your main device for accessing digital news. You can see the smartphone rising inexorably. You can see the computer really falling. And that's not because there's fewer computers in offices or in homes. It's just that the smartphone is more convenient. It's more personal. It's just with you all the time. So the smartphone is kind of eating time from these other devices. And just to make that a little bit more real, it's always with you, essentially. And so 46% of smartphone users admitted to using their smartphones for news in bed. And in the bathroom and the toilet, 32%. So there's more in some countries than others. I'm not going to name or shame them here. But I think the other point is that that the use outside the home, so you see 42% using it on smartphones on public transport, the use outside the home is now less than the usage within the home. So this is not just about mobility. The mobile is not about mobility, it's about the personal nature of that device. I think one interesting finding this year, which kind of relates to that, is that the mobile app seems to be making some kind of comeback. So across our survey, 27% say that the mobile app on smartphone or tablet uses a mobile app on smartphone or tablet weekly. But after years when essentially that figure has remained the same since we started doing the survey, we've seen a significant increase in the last year. So just to take some examples, Sweden, 31%, so the dark is 2016, the lighter color is 2017, 6% increase, Korea, 9% increase, the US, that looks like about 8% increase. So quite significant changes in just 1 year. And what we found when we sort of looked at what other things were going on is that these were all countries where we've also seen a really big increase in mobile alerts and notifications. And obviously, a whole load of publishers have been sending out more mobile alerts and notifications. You heard Corey Haight talking about that earlier, and other people on the panel. So as the mobile becomes more important, so does the lock screen, and so does the mobile alerts, which we see increasing significantly. And I think so it's probably not new people, it's the same people coming back more regularly as you use these retention strategies to get people coming back to your mobile app. I think the other really interesting thing is that it's not just publishing apps now, and I think an illustration of that is what we've seen with Apple News over the last week. Again, really significant change. So on this stage a year ago, I talked about how not very many people were using Apple News in those very few countries where it operates. But the introduction of notifications as part of iOS 10, combined with the Spotlight feature and the introduction of those news widgets, and the increased prominence of that, and the link of those things to the Apple News app, which has not happened in all countries, but in some countries, means that we've seen the growth of Apple News about doubled. And now 25% of iPhone users say that they are accessing Apple News app at least once a week. And we see similar developments with Snapchat Discover as well. Again, last year I said it was making little impact apart from in its target market of 18 to 24s just in the US. So we've seen that growing in the US, but we've also seen the international expansion. So this is partly, again, because Snapchat themselves within the interface have made it much easier. So you can now subscribe to news brands, and that integrates within the whole app. So that has made a huge difference to the usage within Snapchat, again, just within that target market. So this is not a universal thing. This is about Snapchat Discover. But we see reach doubling, and of course it's expanded to non-English speaking countries, so France, as we can see, and Norway and Germany. Germany is also starting soon. And then in terms of new devices, so it's still early days, but it's really interesting to see the speed with which voice-activated speakers are taking off compared with, on the right, smartwatches, which have been around for a while. So the Amazon Echo and the Google Home have only been around in many countries, for a few months in some cases, or a year at maximum. But already we see, some levels of penetration, And over half of those users in the US and the UK are already using those devices for news. So I think this is definitely one to watch. I think if it is something that takes off, obviously it introduces another platform player in the name of Amazon that the news industry is going to need to deal with and get used to. Not the Washington Post, of course. Okay, so finally, to the business issues. To what extent do worries about fake news and polarization and biased news feed through to increased willingness to pay for the news? So the answer is, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have seen a significant change in the United States. So the percentage paying for some kind of online news has risen by 7 percentage points. So it was 9%, it's now 16%. I think what's interesting is a lot of the increase has been driven largely by young people and also largely by people on the political left. So there's been an increase in donations as well, 3 to 4 times in the United States. And of those people who are paying, 29% say that they are doing it to help journalism. So the equivalent figure in other countries is 13%, so more than twice as likely to try and help save journalism in that particular environment. And then the figures on the right, you can see, obviously, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, etc., have been reporting these, gleefully, these increases in the number of paying subscribers. On the other hand, more generally, we don't really see this Trump effect. So slight increases in some countries, but broadly, still, only a minority is paying for online news, so the average is around 13%. But again, very, very strong regional differences. So here in Europe, you can see that the darker colors here are where the penetration of people who are paying for online news is highest. And you can see it's Scandinavia, and the reasons for that we talked about before, but it's strong reading tradition. They're obviously small markets, protected by language, strong, also a place where actually they're using data and technology in a very smart way to get new subscribers and to upsell existing subscribers. So that's the darker ones, and you can see the lighter ones. It's lowest, so highest in Norway, lowest in the UK at 6%, and also in Greece. And part of the reason, of course, is that in those countries, very few providers even try to charge for online news, including commercial providers in the UK. So in focus groups this year, there were some hopeful signs. So a number of the people we talked to kind of recognized that in the future, they probably would have to pay for news, and they were willing to pay for news, but they basically said, why should we when there's so much free news around? There's no concerted effort in my country to make this happen. So that's something to think about going forward. That's obviously particularly an issue in English-speaking countries. And then I think it's really interesting, for the first time this year, we looked at how news payment online compared with payment for Spotify and Netflix for other types of digital news, essentially. And this chart basically shows that by age. So along the bottom, you have 18 to 24 going through to older people and 55 plus. And what you're seeing at the top is people who are subscribing to Netflix or the equivalents. And then the blue line is music. And you can see broadly that there are some overlaps. There's some correlation in terms of age with news as well. So this is quite surprising. So younger people essentially subscribing to many of these services. And just to give you an example, this is somebody we talked to a focus group in the US. So this is a young person in his 20s who's paying for the New York Times. He donated to The Guardian. He's paying for The Intercept, and he made some payment to Young Turks, which is a YouTube channel. Just giving the sort of the extent to which a probably not very representative young person in the States is doing this. But I think what this does, both the qualitative and quantitative evidence counters that narrative that young people won't pay for anything and they aren't interested in paying for news. So finally, let's look at ad blocking and how that's changed in the last year. So overall, despite dire predictions, it's actually not grown at all significantly in the last year. So still about a quarter of online users are ad blocking, but it hasn't really spread to mobile. 7% is about what it was this time last year. We asked people whether people had responded to those messages asking you if you would temporarily disable your ad blocker for a news site that you liked, for a particular news site. And the answer is yes, 43% had done that in the last year. And we asked them why they'd done it. So what had prompted you to do that? Was it people asked you nicely, or were you made to do it? And the answer is that asking nicely doesn't work. Basically, if it's the only way to view the content, 58% of people said that was the reason, though interestingly, 12% wanted to see the adverts. So I think some relatively good news there, though we should remember that Google and Apple are about to reignite that debate through browser levy blocking very soon. So I'm sure we'll be talking about that next year. So just a quick recap. Trust is low. There's a problem with signal and noise, but the news media is valued more than social media in separating fact from fiction. Secondly, following on from that, there is an opportunity for news organizations to build on that, to create valuable experiences that people will return to again and again. So I think there is some real opportunity there. Social media remains critical for news, but we're seeing this shift to more closed messaging applications again. There are a whole load of questions about how media companies can capitalize on that. And then the role with platforms remains complicated. They play a very valuable role in exposing people to more sources of news. Not everyone's going to come to your website. This is a great way of reaching people, but brand recognition, a whole load of other issues remain a huge issue, and we'll be talking about it, I can guarantee you, in a year's time. So just finally, I've thrown a lot of data at you, and just as a way of recapping, we prepared a very convenient 2-minute summary where you can just lean back, a film summary, video summary, where you can lean back and enjoy again some of the key points, and also it gives you a chance to think about any questions you might want to ask.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thanks to all of you. And it said there you can download the report. You can indeed download it. But as I say, at the end of this session, you can also pick up a hard copy if you like, that kind of thing. So let's move to questions. We've got about 8 minutes or so for questions, and the first one is there. Can you tell us who you are? Yes, please. Hi.
Hi, I'm Estra, Deutsche Welle now.
Hi.
So I have two non-related questions. The first one is about Snapchat. In your presentation, you mentioned that about 80% of the people that you surveyed are checking into a Facebook product about once a week. Snapchat went public this year, and there's been a lot of speculation since they did that Facebook will basically crush them by the end of the year. And the only region that it's really growing is in the Arab world. So my first question is, do you think that that's going to happen? And then the second reason is you have a very interesting finding that more people are moving into private messenger apps. Can you explain and talk a little bit about why?
Yeah, so I think Snapchat, obviously Facebook are trying to, with Instagram in particular, trying to copy all their features, but they still have a very loyal audience, and certainly for Discover, it's doing very well from an audience point of view. So, I always go and talk to students, and I always ask them, are you using Snapchat? And the next question is, are you using Snapchat Discover? And for the last few years, they all say, yes, I'm using Snapchat, and then nobody says Snapchat Discover. But this year, they've started to say it. And so I think we are really seeing a step change there. And I think it's partly because they've integrated it. It's partly because of the quality of the brands that are now on there. I mean, Le Monde is doing a fantastic job. It's not just flippant news, though obviously a lot of people are using Cosmopolitan. So I think that was Snapchat. I think they're very, very interesting and innovative technologically, and I think it's good to have another platform apart from Facebook and Twitter that publishers can work with. I think they've brought a lot of innovation. On the rest of it, in terms of why people are using social media, I think I touched on, in some countries it's because of it's dangerous to talk openly. So some of the countries where we've seen the biggest increase, like Turkey I mentioned, I think it's because of that. In other countries it's because it's bundled. Essentially you get, in Brazil and South American countries, it's actually free. So your internet is free. It comes bundled with WhatsApp stuff, whereas if you use other ones, so that's why we've seen a huge change in Brazil. So I think Facebook's down 11 percentage points in our data, and WhatsApp is up hugely.
Okay, can we take a couple more questions? If somebody can get a microphone, there's a question over there.
Can I ask you a question before the microphone gets to her?
Sorry, yes.
It's Peter Bale, David.
Yes, Peter.
Using chairman's privilege.
Indeed.
Can you say any more about the trust bit at the beginning, or was that not a question that you asked last year, so it's very difficult to give you is there any perspective on how that's shifted over the past year, and any advice that you would give us, particularly based on what you heard this morning from Richard Gingras and Marty Barron?
It's the first time we've asked specifically about this issue of, I think the problem with general trust questions is there's so many things that go on beneath the surface of that. And so that's why, in addition to doing the general trust question, we wanted to really look in more detail at the social media thing and the separating fact from fiction. And then beyond that, we asked, in 10 countries, we asked people why. Why do you trust social media? Why do you trust mainstream media? Why don't you? And in fact, we're still analysing a lot of the answers to that to really sort of understand that. But I think what surprised me was the extent of political bias in those countries that are polarised, and that's the main reason. It's the main reason for mistrust in social media, and it's the main reason why people don't trust traditional media in the States as well. It's political bias. In other countries, the fault line won't be about political bias, it'll be about something else, or there'll be other issues going on. So I think you can't say it's the same thing in every country, and that's the problem with these sort of surveys like ours that just sort of list them all, and you have to go beneath that, I think.
But just to add, in most countries, people's trust in the media they use is higher than in the media in general, which is what you'd expect. And in the most polarized countries, you see some of the biggest gulfs between those. Not everywhere, but that's the case in some countries. And that question, in that way, is a question we asked 2 years ago and then this year. Question over there. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, David. Hi, Nick. Nice to see you again, Nick. Andrew DeMaria from CNN. Great presentation, great video. And speaking of video, I noticed that there wasn't much reference to video in that presentation. What do we read into that?
I think you should read the fact that we're doing video that I believe in video. So we didn't put the question in, we didn't put the data in about, it's in the main report, you can read it. It's very similar to last year, which is basically people still prefer text and young people still prefer text. So yes, we are, obviously the internet is becoming video enabled, more people are using video, but the issue of control and speed for many people still trumps that. And again, it's another question I always ask students when I go and talk to them, young people, do you prefer video or text? And it always goes up for text. Because although they use video, because they're exposed to it more, so if you look at the statistics, it shows that young people are using more video, they don't prefer it more, I don't think, than older people, older groups.
Any more questions? Any things people want to raise? If not, I have one. Am I missing a hand somewhere? No? Let me just ask, Nick, let me just ask you a question about news apps. We've looked at news apps in previous years, and you've said here that the use of apps is increasing. In previous years, when we've looked at this, we've sort of said it's very hard because of the limited real estate on a smartphone screen to get your app there. But if once you get it, that's a pretty good way of securing your place, as long as people don't delete the app. So what implications do you draw about the kind of relative increase in use of news apps for news brands retaining a strong link with their users?
I think it's that wider question that to make money in the long term, you have to have a relationship over time that you've built up. So you need more direct channels. And I think the news app is obviously one of those. We've heard people talk about email this morning, which is incredibly important. And again, we see increasing in our data every year. So I think email, apps, your own channels, that's what media companies need to focus on. Obviously, you know, they're not going to reach everyone through those channels, and that's why the distributed part is also important. So it's not destination or distribution, it's both. And I think the news app has become more important because the lock screen is important. You have to get onto the lock screen, you have to get those notifications, you have to have that direct relationship. And so what you're seeing people like the Washington Post do and New York Times is using things like Apple News to get people to download, as marketing, to download the app. So at the top of all those articles in Apple News, you've got, please download our app. And I think that is also having an effect on why we're seeing a rise in apps.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up there. Just to remind you all that the copies of the report are at the back of the room. If you happen to come from at the side of the room, at
one
the back,
there and one at the back.
One at the back as well. If you happen to come from Norway, Sweden, in particular, make sure you pick up the sheet of paper that has some corrections on it. But otherwise, if you're from those countries as well, download the report. And as we said in the presentation, there's a dedicated website, digitalnewsreport.org. So thanks to all of you for listening, and thanks to Nick for presenting this year's findings. Thank you.
Primarily, you should pay for it, since they pay for their content. Thanks, David.